Now, I do want to start out this video by warning you that there will be spoilers for the fourth episode of The Mandalorian, so if you haven't seen it yet and you don't want anything ruined, it's a really good time to click away. That said, though I didn't think this was a bad episode by any stretch, I will say that, for me, it was probably the weakest one so far, and really, it was the first time I was left with a few issues. But before getting into that, let me say that one of the strengths of this episode, not to mention the whole series, are the interactions between the Mandalorian and Baby Yoda, especially towards the beginning of this episode while they were still on the ship. The only way I can describe it is to say it was a subtle, adorable humor that really worked and really shows us the unique dynamic between these two very, very different characters. It showed us how much the Mandalorian is really beginning to not only tolerate Baby Yoda, but to truly care about him, and likely in spite of himself. And what's crazy here is I think Baby Yoda could have gone all sorts of wrong overall for this show, that there was every chance it wouldn't have worked and fans would be looking at it and asking, what is this? What are you trying to do here, and why is there a Baby Yoda in a show about Mandalorians and bounty hunting? And yet, despite how wrong I think it could have gone, or how odd it could have come off as, the bond forming between the two is really the heart and soul of the show, and I'm sure there is a gut-wrenching scene coming at the end of the season where the two will part ways for the final time, or at least for quite a while. Another big positive of this episode is we continue to learn more about the Mandalorian and the culture of its people. We learn no one has seen his face since he was a child and put the helmet on, or a helmet on, for the very first time. And if anybody sees his face, he doesn't get to put it back on again, which is somehow both harsh and badass sounding at the same time, though it also continues to conflict greatly with what we've seen previously out of Mandalorians elsewhere in the new canon, where they've had their helmets off in front of each other all the time. And as I speculated in last week's review, this could very well be a return to their old ways, back to a time when they were more hardcore, you could say, with their rules or way of life, that this is the way now because that was the way then when they thrived, and before a pacifist movement swept through their people, as we see in the Clone Wars. Hell, just how difficult and strict a way of life this is could be the reason why so many ultimately wanted to turn from it and seek another way, which is why the pacifist movement eventually gained momentum. Another good possibility here, and many brought this up in the comments of last week's video, is that this not removing your helmet in front of others thing could be a new rule that came about in the wake of the Great Purge, and their leader even mentioned something about how their secrecy is their survival and their strength. This could be a whole new level of devotion for them in an attempt to survive the greatest threat to their way of life ever. Either way, I see all that we're learning about Mandalorians here early on in this show as a way of, shall we say, undoing some of the damage, for a lack of a better way of putting it, that was done to them in the Clone Wars animated series, where most of them, outside of groups like Death Watch, again had become pacifists, which is not what I think most of us fans had in mind when we finally got to learn more about them in what you could call official George Lucas canon. And it's not that I hated them in the Clone Wars. They were certainly a part of some fantastic storylines, some of the best in the show, in fact. But they didn't feel like Mandalorians to me, outside of Death Watch, of course. And in this new show, this is what I've always kind of imagined Mandalorians to be, going all the way back to when I was a kid and learned that Boba Fett was supposedly a member of, or at least wore the armor of, this race of warrior people known as Mandalorians that hunted and killed Jedi. And I always got the impression he rarely removed his helmet in front of others just because. And speaking of removing helmets, as I think we kind of expected, in this episode we get it confirmed that they can remove their helmets when they are alone to eat or do whatever else they need to do. And he even does so in this very episode, though we of course don't get to see his face. And he watches as a group of the village kids play with Baby Yoda, which I thought was an absolutely great moment. That free of his helmet or free of this oath he's pretty much taken upon himself, this oath to never show his face, he gets to look upon people just living a normal life, and he likely begins to ponder what it must be like. And for whatever reason, when it happened, I couldn't help but hear Vader in my head saying, "Let me look upon you with my own eyes." But anyway, part of the idea of this episode, I feel, is that we do see that somewhere within the Mandalorian that maybe there is a desire for a more simple or normal life. Not that he questions being a Mandalorian or seems like he's looking for a reason to give it up or to find a way out. In fact, in this episode, he even says how extremely grateful he is that they saved his life, and he seems to have no regrets. Yet at the same time, it has to be very difficult and lonely, especially when you find another person that you're maybe somewhat interested in, which kind of happens in this episode, I feel. And I'm very curious to know if at any point Mandalorians are allowed to take off their helmets in front of others, maybe as part of some sort of ritual, or perhaps, and hopefully, when they choose a mate or a partner or wed or whatever they do. I mean, with there being so few of them now, I'd kind of imagine that sort of thing might be encouraged, finding a mate and making little Mandalorians, I mean. And I'm curious to see if the show addresses that sort of thing at some point. I'm curious at what age does a young Mandalorian usually put their helmet on for the first time? I can't deny the show has got me really curious to learn a lot more about their culture. As for the plot of the episode itself here, well, to be honest, it's one I think we've seen many times before. It's the old warrior comes in and trains a village of people to defend themselves from the bad guys trope. And really, it's done okay here. No better or worse than I've seen elsewhere. And considering we're basically at the midpoint of the season here, I wasn't surprised to get an episode like this, one that felt a bit more filler in nature, or lets us catch our breath heading towards the homestretch. I didn't expect all 8 episodes to keep constantly ramping things up, or to completely knock it out of the park each and every time, or to always progress the story in a monumental way. This was also the first episode that I was a bit confused by a few things, or thought we could really use a couple things elaborated upon. Like, how do the fobs work? How are targets tracked exactly? How did, as we see at the end of the episode, another bounty hunter track down Baby Yoda, and the Mandalorian confirms it was him who was tracked? In the first episode, I kind of figured it was the little pod he was riding in that was what was actually being tracked, not that he himself was being tracked somehow. And if he is being tracked, does the Mandalorian not know a way to nullify or mask how he's being tracked? I mean, he went to this planet to lay low and far away from anyone who might know he's wanted, or so I assume. I assumed no one was going to be able to use a fob to find either one of them again, either Baby Yoda or the Mandalorian, I mean. That he'd likely taken care of that somehow, if it needed taking care of, and was now trying to find a place where he wouldn't be recognized by sight by anyone. Yet the fobs still seem to work, so what's actually his plan here? Did he think they were still being tracked or not? Because his original intention here, until the bounty hunter showed up at the end, was that he was going to leave Baby Yoda with the villagers. So did he not know the fobs still worked, or that they could be used to track him still? I mean, I would think he'd be 100% certain Baby Yoda couldn't be tracked before he left him anywhere, and as a member of the Bounty Hunter Guild, I'd really think he knows how the fobs work. Though, who knows, I guess. Maybe how Baby Yoda is still being tracked will end up being a plot point that the Mandalorian will be looking for answers to next week. Maybe the Empire put a tracker in Baby Yoda that the Mandalorian is unable to detect, or there's another explanation entirely for how the fobs work, like they can track DNA or something along those lines. But again, the Mandalorian would probably know that. One way or another here, this is really something I'd like to see the show clarify. Another small complaint I had with this episode is they once again tried to get you for a moment with the exact same trick they used from the first episode, where they led you to believe that Baby Yoda had been shot by IG-11, but it turned out the Mandalorian had shot him. This time it was Cara Dune shooting a bounty hunter from behind right before he sniped Baby Yoda that they tried to get us with. Again, another very minor annoyance that by no means ruined the episode, and it'd be very curious if they try the trick for a third time, but actually shoot Baby Yoda. Anyway, speaking of Cara Dune, she finally shows up in this episode, and she is a former rebellion shock trooper who, after Endor, helped deal with the remnants of the Empire, oftentimes getting dropped into situations without backup. But when they started to run out of Imperials to deal with and it became more just peacekeeping, she decided to leave. And the show kind of implies she was on the run and in hiding for some reason, which is why she took off when the Mandalorian, who she feared was with the guild, showed up. But it didn't say why exactly. Now, I don't know if I missed something or misinterpreted, or if we just weren't told the reason, and maybe we'll get it revealed later, but either way, the Mandalorian kind of shrugs his shoulders at one point and says the planet is hers and that they have to leave now. This was yet another moment that left me just a little confused. I mean, I do get that if someone comes looking for her or for him, they might then find the other person too. So in a sense, it doubles your chance of being found if you're by someone else on the run. But it seemed like a big enough planet where you could just lay low elsewhere on it. Again, another small gripe, or something that maybe learning more about the tracking fobs might clear up. As for the character of Cara Dune herself, Well, so far so good, I'd say. I mean, we basically just got her generic backstory about being in the rebellion like I talked about before, and that alone, being a former rebel or willing to fight for the good cause, likely explains her willingness to help on a mission where she only got paid lunch money, as she says. That, and maybe she also liked the idea of getting to lay low at some very remote village. Again, I don't know that the show was very clear about just what was up with her exactly. But then again, she'll be in more episodes. Not to mention, they've very much given us the impression she's one of the main characters of the series, so I'm sure more will come in time, even though they do part ways at the end of this episode. Though I also have little doubt she'll show up towards the end of the season, when I very much suspect that the Mandalorian will round up his posse for a big showdown, one likely with the Empire who has gotten their hands on Baby Yoda again. All in all here, it was a good episode, but not the best or my favorite thus far. We do learn more about the Mandalorian and his ways. We learn he no doubt leads a lonely life, and maybe there's a part of him that dreams of something more or something different. And we also got to see a Lothcat in live action, so there's that. The final battle with the AT-ST was also great. The action in this show has not been a disappointment, nor has it been a letdown visually. That's another department that continues to impress, especially considering it is a TV show, if you will. The long-awaited introduction of Cara Dune was okay, and I look forward to more of her character in the future, but the deal with the fobs, how they work, and so on, is something that I really feel the show needs to address. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this episode, or what you've thought of the show so far. Or feel free to speculate on how the fobs work or anything else. Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.